Go. Um, Hello, friends. Welcome to our Spotlight sessions. Like we said before, one of our main desire for this videos is to pick up maybe difficult subjects or relevant subjects from the Bible, doctrine, history, church history, and to be able to explore and how we can build one another up through this short videos. And I hope you would find this helpful. We have today with us Jonathan Thomas, who is the pastor of Cornerstone Church in Abergavenny. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you, Bram. Good to be with you.
Thank you. And I see you have had an injury.
Yes.
Is it writing too much sermon during the lockdown?
That's the problem. No, I went out on my bike and I went over the handlebars. So don't cycle in your 40s. That's my tip.
We will remember that. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. My name is Abraham. I am one of the staff here at St. Mark's. Thank you again, Jonathan, for joining us. One of the things that I really wanted to ask you and interview you on today's video is really about the revival that took place in Wales in 1904, 1905. You've done a little bit of talks, not necessarily on the revival itself, but I think in the Wales Leadership Forum, you did a character sketch or a talk on Thomas Charles and David Davis. So, Jonathan, would you be able to tell us a brief summary of what happened in 1904, 1905, particularly that for us, the younger generation, we know what happened, but not fully. Would you like to tell us a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so when 1900 came, the church in Wales was in decline. So in two ways. So on the one hand, it was in decline in terms of numbers, so that the church was starting to go down, but as well, it was in decline in terms of health. So in the 1800s, towards the end of it, the church, particularly the leaders of the church, had become very academic and as well had kind of started to preach in a fake oil. That is, it was like a performance. So there wasn't really much depth and growth in the church towards the end of the 1800s, start of the 1900s. And so there was a series of meetings in the early 1900s for the deepening of the spiritual life of the believer that was going around Wales. And one of those series of meetings over in kind of Ceredigion, New Quay, and a place called Blaenannerch, there was a series of meetings there, and the young people were really influenced. And one young guy in particular called Evan Roberts, who actually is from Lycha in West Wales, but was over studying in Newcastle Emlyn. And he was there, and during one of these meetings, really prayed of the Lord in Welsh that the Lord would bend him. That is, that the Lord would come and visit him. And he, amongst these other young people in the kind of area, really experienced God in a powerful way. So people perhaps would describe it as the Spirit coming down in power there in Blaenannerch. And so Evan Roberts, this young man, seemed to have been empowered with the Spirit and started to preach the gospel. And he and a number of other people preaching the gospel, and he had a band of young people, particularly women actually, who would travel around with him. And they just started to see masses of conversions. So really in a year, you're talking upwards of about 100,000 people in Wales being converted. I mean, it was so much that church buildings were full. There's accounts of the windows in church buildings being taken out so people could listen through the windows. There's accounts of ministers being converted in the pulpit as the gospel is being preached. People across the world travelled. You'd have people in England putting their children on trains to Wales to go and experience this revival. And the Western Mail, for example, each week would have like a table of leagues of conversions. So, you know, they'd have accounts of churches and how many were converted the week before. And, you know, the paparazzi of the day, for example, would be following Evan Roberts. So it was a very public revival that exploded very quickly across Wales.
And this is the whole of Wales, or north or south, or?
Yeah, the Welsh revival pretty much went across Wales, mainly in the south, but across the north as well. Evan Roberts preached in Liverpool and places like that. In those days, Liverpool had quite a strong Welsh community. But yeah, it generally across Wales.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was listening to a podcast by a well-known pastor, I won't name them, maybe 2 weeks ago. And he was just saying, commenting on the revival that took place in Wales in 1904, 1905. He said something like, it revived a lot of cultural Christianity and chapel-going tradition. He used the word, it was broad and shallow. Do you think that's true?
I mean, it's a good question, and I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I'm not sure. So it's a complex situation. So on the one hand, you had people converted from very rough backgrounds and very non-church-going backgrounds who were converted in great passion and great fervence, and they couldn't settle in churches, in chapels. And really, the chapels didn't make them welcome. There were a lot of ministers and churches that were very resistant to the revival, and they didn't like it. So you had people who were converted very quickly, but then didn't have kind of churches to go to. So two things happened. Some just didn't settle in church. Others settled in churches where the gospel wasn't preached. And so didn't grow, and others just went off and started their own denominations. So post 1904, 1905, you got a lot of denominations like the Apostolic denomination, and then you've got these kind of little hut churches that came up all over Wales, where people would start their own churches. And the decline of the church afterwards was very quick, but you need to realize where you are in history. So, within 10 years of the revival, a large chunk of the converts would have gone to the front in World War I and died. So, it's a very difficult time in the history of the world. And so, a large part of the generation was cut off. I think just in terms of what happens in society in their response to World War I and the rise of kind of modernism, there's a whole host of different things happening in Wales and globally. But I think it's fair to say that most would say it was a genuine revival. But I think many would say it was a very shallow revival. Evan Roberts himself, post-revival, seems to have had something of a breakdown, I guess you would call it now, and very strange. Even kind of our English brothers and sisters in the Keswick movement thought we were strange. We were kind of banned from preaching at Keswick. We would do strange things. It wasn't unheard of for Evan Roberts to go into a pulpit and just sit there quietly waiting for the Spirit to speak to him. So it was very messy. A lot of things happened very quickly. And it was a bit of a mess, really. But I think you have to say people were genuinely converted, a large number of them. But even 200-300 years before, on the other side of the pond, Jonathan Edwards, with revival there, he writes a book on religious experience, and even he would say that within revival there is a mess. There's a work of the Spirit and a work of the flesh, and there's genuine and fake, and it's very muddy.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Jonathan. Again, even in the mess, God can still work amazing things. I personally, I don't doubt that He's done amazing things. But like you said, it's messy, and we quite sure. Before we go into the theological deeper question, what has been the impact of the revival that took place just over 100 years ago in Wales today for our 21st century? What are some of the good things that came out of it that we are still, as churches in Wales, are experiencing because of what happened?
Yeah, so I think it did, to a church in decline, it did give a bit of a shot in the arm, and it did give us a little bit more size and strength. I think it definitely gave a hunger for seeking the lost and a hunger for seeking the Spirit, hence kind of what I was talking about, the kind of Keswick issue. I think that was good. And I do think, it did mean the birth of many new churches. So, a lot of churches were birthed as a result of the 1904 revival, and lots of the next generation would have gone onto the mission field and, spread the gospel around the world. So I think there's lots of strengths there. And I think for many in Wales, not everybody, but for many in Wales, even today, I think it has left a belief that God can do something extraordinary, and that we should desire that. And I think that's happening less and less. But I think that there still is within the DNA of Welsh Christianity a desire for revival. It's fair to say the 1904 revival was the last of kind of a series of revivals that had been kind of rumbling through Wales since the mid 1700s. So, and may have been the messiest of all. But yeah, it's definitely influenced. But I think you would struggle. Well, there wouldn't be anybody left now who experienced the 1904 revival. Some can remember being in prayer meetings with people who were converted during the revival, and those people would comment on a depth of prayer, a depth of love for the Lord and desperation for God that they would say they haven't seen since then.
Thank you, Jonathan. Again, so against the backdrop of the revival in 1904, 1905, so should we, this is more a slightly deeper theological question, and hopefully it'll benefit the wider church as well, that should we as Christians pray for revival and for His Spirit to come and descend upon us, refresh our heart, call us back to Himself? How do we then understand that, where Jesus says the Spirit goes where He decides to go? So should we pray for revival, or should we not? So, and also for us as a church, particularly in Cardiff and beyond, should we ask God for His Spirit to come and revive the land again? Is that a right thing compared to what we see, for example, in the Pentecost? In some ways. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so my simple answer would be yes. My simple answer would be, what is revival? I think revival is two things. It's a reviving of the church. So it's just Christians loving the Lord more. And it is a greater ingathering. So it's a time of more effective evangelism. So I think if you define revival as Christians growing and people becoming Christians, but in greater measure, then I think, yes, we should be praying for it. I long to love the Lord more, and I long to see people coming to know Christ. And I guess what's unique about revival is it would be in larger numbers and over a geographical area, be that a locality or a nation. So I think we should pray for revival, but I think there is a danger, and perhaps a danger that some in Wales fell into unintentionally in the last century, and that is kind of a feeling that if it's not revival, it's not anything, and that if you want to see conversions, you must have revival, and I think that's a misstep. I think the normative way the church advances is in the fringes. It's as sojourners and strangers in the world. I think it's where churches and individuals are living, lives and often quiet lives. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Just lead a quiet life. Work with your hands. 1 Peter, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. So. I think the normal way the church grows actually is just the church living Christian life and sharing the gospel. And that is wonderful. And I would never want to despise the normative work of the Spirit in the church. I think, if one person is converted, that is wondrous. And, if there's rejoicing in heaven over one sinner, then there should be 15. Yeah. So let's never despise that.
Yeah.
And so it's understanding that generally is how God is at work. That does seem to be the way the kingdom expands. But I do think that within God's economy, there are these special times, for whatever reason, in God's goodness, whether it's revival. And just as I would pray for someone's conversion, I think I can pray also for revival.
Thank you, Jonathan. Another question, if I may ask. So you mentioned a few important people who played an important role during the revival. Denominationally, any particular denomination that played an important role in the revival, or is it a group of men and women praying together?
Yeah, I think so. The early meetings, these kind of meetings for the deepening of the spiritual awakening, were part of the Forward movement, which was a kind of evangelistic part of the Calvinistic Methodists. The Calvinistic Methodists had come out of the revivals of the 1700s with Thomas Charles, and before him, Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland. So today we'd call them the Presbyterian Church in Wales. They've changed their name. So really the revival, I guess, came out of the Presbyterian Church in Wales, the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists, as they were known at the time. But really it would have been across the denominations. But as I said, many of the denominations would have rejected it. And so whilst it would have been in churches, very quickly post-revival, they would have got together in other churches. So, because after the revival, there would have been, because the revival had some quite, what we would call Pentecostal elements. The kind of Pentecostal church afterwards would have been birthed. And then influenced America with Azusa Street and all those kind of things. So I think across churches, but it would have come mainly from Welsh Calvinistic Methodists.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Any particular books that you have found helpful that you'd like to recommend for those of us watching?
Yeah, so there's a few good books on revival. Some of them are quite hard to get. So if you want a good introduction to the 1904 revival that's easy to read, there's a book called A Diary of Revival by Kevin Adams. A Diary of Revival by Kevin Adams. You'd have to search, you can get it online. And that's very easy to read and very engaging. There are other books on the 1904 revival. There's one by Brynmor Williams and one by Eifion Evans, and they're worth looking into as well. So yeah, those books would be helpful.
Thank you, Jonathan. And can you buy them on Amazon, 10 of those, or the Heath Bookshop?
Yeah, so the Heath Bookshop would be brilliant. So the Heath would have those books or could get them in for you. And as well, if you wanted to know about you know, I said there was kind of all of these revivals before the 1904. Actually, the Heath have got a book that they've produced, which is this one, which is Favoured with Frequent Revivals. It's a little book that they've produced. And what's great about that one is it covers all of these revivals from 1762 to 1862, and it's full of first-person accounts. So if you want to read what a revival was actually like, that's a book to go to, and that's really heartwarming stuff.
Thank you, Jonathan. Not necessarily on the revival, but I think I remember reading A New Mission to Wales by David Ollerton. I think he picks up a lot on not necessarily on the revival itself, but the impact that it had, and how different denomination, like you mentioned, different churches are coming to terms, and how they've been positively impacted by the revival that took place in 1904, 1905. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us. I hope you've been blessed by our video. If you'd like to comment, please do get in touch with us. That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us.